Ghost Towns. Share the adventures of our early pioneers as we explore the development of the Pacific Northwest and beyond. With your host, Mike Roberts, and historian Bill Barlee.
Welcome to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. I'm Mike Roberts, and with me is Bill Barlee, our storyteller for these programs. And what a story we have to tell today. Before Bill told me, just before we started the show, I had never heard of this guy, but he's no role model. No. He's a bad character named Smith. Tell me about him.
Well, Mike, most people have heard of the Wild Bunch, you know,
sure.
Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and they've heard of Jesse James, and they've heard of Bill Miner, and they've heard of Black Bart. Very few people have heard of Jefferson Randolph Smith.
I must say, I was among those who'd not heard of Jefferson Randolph Smith.
Okay. A little background on this guy. He was the smoothest of them all, a confidence man or a bunco artist, whatever you want to call him. And he had a heart of stone, but on first impression, he didn't reveal that. And he'd been born in Georgia in 1860, about the beginning of the Civil War, came west, and eventually, and because of his background, I think because of his background, probably came from a fairly prominent family. We are led to believe that has never been proven, but he developed very fine manners, and he was articulate, he was extremely persuasive, and he was the king of the confidence men in the far west.
So this guy was unequaled at the ability to extract money from you and leave you penniless.
Precisely.
All right. What was his nickname?
Soapy.
Soapy Smith. We're going to come back in just a second to find out where Soapy Smith served, I guess, his early education in the area of confidence trickstering and where he became king. Don't go away. Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Mike Roberts and Bill Barlee addressing the subject of a ne'er-do-well by the name of Jefferson Randolph Smith, known to his friends as Soapy. Where did he get that?
Known to his friends and his enemies as Soapy. Well, here we have a photograph of Soapy Smith, and this is probably taken in Denver in the early years, probably late 1880s, perhaps early 1890s. And what happened, Mike, is kind of interesting because he was a cowboy on the Chisholm Trail. And he was driving north, taking cattle into Kansas and places like that, and came back, he was in his 20s then, came back to San Antonio, Texas. And he had pay for the season, really quite well off. Went to a fair. That was his first mistake. Second mistake, he began watching one of these manipulators at the fair, and he had three little walnut shells, three half walnut shells.
The old shell game is...
The old shell game. And the object
This was when the shell game was new, is this right?
Oh, for sure, sure.
Okay.
And the object was you could bet which they had a little pea, and they put that under one of the shells, and then moved the shells around almost faster than the eye could follow, and indeed it was. And so Smith decided to try a couple of dollars in this. And he tried it, and he guessed wrong. He tried again and guessed wrong, tried again and guessed wrong, and inside of an hour, he was cleaned out. His whole season's pay gone in an hour. Now, he didn't fly off the handle or anything else. He said, ooh, that's interesting. He said, here I've worked for months and months and months, under very adverse conditions, and this guy's taking
the stimulus for getting him into the confidence game.
Just like that. And then he went into Leadville, Colorado, and Colorado was wide open then, and Leadville was one of the boom towns, and he teamed up with a guy called Taylor and began to refine his art. And this is really where he got the name Soapy, because not only was he good at the shell game, Mike, he took a bar of soap, and around that bar of soap, he'd have all these bars of soap out there, and in a little kit, trip and keister they called it, little kit.
Trip and keister.
Yeah, and they would set up this little stand and gather people around by pitching, you know, you want to make some money, and of course people are interested, they don't quite trust them, and he would wrap $100 bills, $50 bills, $20 bills, $10 bills, $5 bills, few twos in this wrapper and put it on the soap. And people would watch him very closely, and anybody want to try it? Well, people are a little reluctant to. Finally one guy comes up and he says, this is a shill, unknown to the audience.
Sure.
Okay, this is a contact man. And he says, I'll take that one, I think there's a good bill under there. And so he'd open it, no, sure enough, there's a $50 bill. Well, this gets the crowd going. And they start buying, and unfortunately, they're very unlucky.
What's he selling this soap for now? I mean,
$5 a barrel, $5 a bar. And $5 a bar is quite a bit of money in that day, you see. It's several days' wages.
Sure.
And as soon as business starts to slacken off, another guy from the audience comes up and says, different guy this time, another shill. And he says, oh, I'll take that one. And by golly, he comes up with a $100 bill. And he disappears, and he's very elated, and of course they play their roles perfectly, and then it starts again, and they continue this for several hours until they either, A, the audience is gone, or they've used up all the bars of soap, and usually when they've used up all the bars of soap. And so he becomes known as Soapy Smith. Nobody is better at that game than Soapy Smith. But around him, he leaves Leadville, and he gathers together. This time he's going to go big time. And he goes into the biggest town in the territory, and this is Denver, Colorado. And Denver is a wide-open town, and Holiday Street is the worst street of all. So he sets up on Holiday Street.
This is Holiday as in Doc Holiday.
Well, it's spelled the same way, yeah. And whether it was named after Doc Holiday or not, I don't know. Probably it was. And he sets up there, and he gathers around him the biggest bunch of vagabonds that you'd ever lay eyes on. And one of them's called Doc Baggs, and Doc Baggs was the original confidence man. He came to put the gold brick game together, Mike.
Now, this is the gold brick game comes by the name, honestly. I just happen to have one of Doc Baggs' gold bricks here, and what it amounted to was what? Describe it.
Well, what it amounted to was this. The brick he would be trying to sell would be many times bigger than that, or bricks, period.
Sure.
And of course they were gold-plated over lead, and lead has practically the same specific gravity as gold. So they would scratch off the first quarter of an inch. By golly, it was gold all the way in. And I guess his most brilliant maneuver was selling a gold brick to a mine owner who was experienced and a U.S. senator. Made $25,000, which, multiply that by 40, that's equivalent to about $1 million today.
That's wonderful.
And, but there was the disadvantage in that game. You had to be on the move all the time.
I can see that.
So Doc Baggs was the end of his career, but he told Soapy all about the gold brick game. Soapy didn't do much in the gold brick game, but he had other individuals that were equally fascinating. And one of the guys they had was a guy called Icebox Murphy. Now, Icebox Murphy, Mike, was a guy who wanted to be the greatest safe blower in the United States. And he tried a few little jobs, and they thought, okay, he's ready to go big time. And there was a big butcher shop in Denver. And they said, okay, look it, we want you to go in there, blow the safe, blow the wall safe in the butcher shop, and then open the door. And the only way they could get in was through a transom, and he was small enough he could get in there. So they lower him through the transom, and he goes down there with the blanket and the dynamite and all the rest of it and the fuse, and they hear a muffled boom, and he opens the door, and they rush in, and they see the door is wide open, it's been blown open, but on the floor are a whole bunch of things, and the things are not very encouraging, because they're chickens, and their sides of beef, and their legs, and what he did is, he went in and made a mistake. He blew the actual locker into the frozen fruit locker.
That's ridiculous. So this was going to haunt him for the rest of his life.
Sure. He never got over the
Icebox what?
Icebox Murphy.
Icebox Murphy.
And there were other individuals, too, you know. I mean, there was a guy in there who was, I think, probably the smoothest of them all, Reverend Charles Bowers.
There always seems to be a minister in here somewhere.
Well, he wasn't really a minister, but he went by that. And he looked like a minister. He had that mien, he had a very friendly look, and he knew all the fraternal grips of the Masons and all the rest. And so he passed off. He could make friends with anybody. And, of course, he was the ideal contact man. But he began to form the nucleus of a real
gang. I mean,
closely knit gang, and a couple of others. There was one guy there who really didn't seem to belong in the gang. His name was George Wilder, and George Wilder was the banker, and he was the only guy who actually had money in the bank. So whenever they needed money, he could draw it out of the bank. And then Fatty Gray, of course, 300-pound guy who was equally adept with his fists and with his guns. He ended up in rather poor shape too. He was shot down in a saloon brawl as well. He picked on a bar.
A common end to these.
Oh sure, no doubt about it at all. But everybody was on the payroll, and including the barbers. And it's very interesting because what happened with the barbers on Holiday Street was this. They would, a stranger would come into town, they would engage him in conversation and so on and so forth, and if they felt he had a lot of money, they would put a little mark on the back of his neck, an inverted V. And as he walked down the street, unknown to him, he would be picked up, befriended by Bowers or one of the other henchmen of Soapy Smith.
And he would be marked. He would be a mark.
That's where the original word came from. The little inverted V in the back of the neck, because you couldn't see it, you see.
We owe the word mark to Soapy Smith.
Oh, for sure. Oh, for sure.
Tremendous.
Yeah. And eventually, of course, things came to an end in Denver. And
he had to. I mean,
sure. He had milked that market long enough, and they cleaned Denver up. And so he went into a real boom town called Creede, Colorado, not too far north. But it was a silver town and lots of money in Creede, about 10,000 people. But he had a little competition in Creede. And one of the competitors was a guy that he gave wide berth to, and this is Bat Masterson. Okay, now Bat Masterson, of course, was with Wyatt Earp and was with Doc Holliday and all the others, and very good with the guns. But Masterson's also, he respected Soapy Smith, and he stayed away from him. There's another strange guy in there, and a guy called Bob Ford. Now, if you recall Western history, Bob Ford was the guy who killed Jesse James.
Is this the dirty little coward that shot Mr. Howard and laid poor Jesse in his grave?
Same guy. He was eventually killed by a drifter called Ed O'Kelly.
Yeah.
And
This
Ed
is
O'Kelly-
dangerous company for Soapy Smith to find himself in.
Oh, yeah.
Did they manage to survive, co-inhabit this place?
Well, eventually Creed cleans up, too. He loses control of the council, loses control of the judiciary, loses control of the police.
So
he
all the
moves
people
out.
he had to buy in order to make a living.
Sure. So he moves back again, very temporarily, to Denver. And then in Denver, he hears about a magnificent rush in the north. And this, of course, is the Klondike Gold Rush. And it begins to attract worldwide attention. He gets his gang together, and, you know, the gang now includes other individuals. A very interesting old man called Van Triplett, who is known on the trails as Old Man Trip. And he has a saintly mien, and he looks and acts like he's anyone's grandfather. But the trouble is, the guy has a heart of absolute granite, and he's joined by other individuals like Yamo Hopkins, who was, Yamo was Chinese evidently for Wildcat, and this is where he got his name because he protected the Tong leaders in San Francisco, and he takes Charlie Bowers, you know, Reverend Charles Bowers north, and he takes the Flapjack Kid, and he takes all these individuals. He leaves with a small gang, and he heads up the coast of western North America, and then up the coast of British Columbia, and he stops off very briefly at Wrangell, Alaska, doesn't think it's going to make it, and he goes up towards two other towns. He goes up towards Dyea, Alaska, which is in an inlet, and another town called Skagway, Alaska. And here you have a look at Skagway, how it looked.
There aren't
would be
even
about...
any piers here. They're bringing everything ashore in boats.
Actually, they have, but they don't want to pay the price they have to pay for unloading on the piers. Okay, so some of them are loading right on the mud flats, and this is how it looked actually when he lands in Skagway. And not only that, so you see the horses out here, and they're waiting quite patiently. They know it's flat out there, and they're going to take the load off and cart it into shore, and they'll pile it above high tide. And then you go back into the town itself. This is Skagway, 1897.
Muck in the street.
This is Broadway. This is the main street of Skagway. And you can see the ruts along here, and it's practically impassable. But that's very interesting because on the right-hand side of this photograph, Mike, is Clancy's Saloon, and this is the saloon that Jeff Davis walks in, or excuse me, Soapy Smith walks in, and he says, I like this guy. The guy's name is Clancy. He becomes his partner.
So this is the first step Soapy Smith has made to becoming the king of Skagway.
The very first step, and the right step for him.
All right, we're going to take a break here, but be coming back in a second to see how Skagway grows and how Soapy Smith's reputation and reign grows in Skagway. Don't go away.
Taking all my pay in an hour. I think I'll learn this profession.
And that was... Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Mike Roberts and Bill Barley, and talking about Soapy Smith, but good to start with a bit of geography lesson just before we do that. This is a great map, 1901.
Yep.
If you wanted to get to the gold fields, which would be up here in the Yukon Territory in northern British Columbia, you had to come up from the ocean, up the Chilkoot Inlet to the Dyea Inlet, and there were two towns. Skagway first, which you'd have to go up, what pass here? This is the White Pass?
You'd have to go up White Pass.
White Pass up here. Or you could go up to Dyea, and then you take the Chilkoot Pass.
That's right.
Great photograph. That's the route you'd have to take to go up there. Now, Skagway's where Smith decides to call home.
It's about twice as big as Dyea. He's right. They have to stop at Skagway first, and they usually do, because they're so anxious to get into the gold fields. Even if they eventually go by Chilkoot, they still stop in Skagway. And he's all ready for them. First of all, he has his saloon, which he calls Jeff Smith's Oyster Parlor.
Jeff Smith's Oyster Parlor.
That's right.
Is this the photograph of it?
Yeah, that's the inside of it, actually, in conjunction with Clancy's Saloon. And that's probably Clancy behind the bar. And he's all ready. If they don't get him by playing a crooked poker game with very, very sharp dealers, or with a rigged roulette wheel, they'll get him another way. They'll get him with a fake packing company or a fake telegraph office or mining companies that sell phony stocks. He has it all figured out, and he has the band to do it. The bigger band of cutthroats you've never seen.
All of this crew you told us he brought up from Denver.
Sure. And so what happens, of course, he starts to get a very bad name, which is not unusual, of course, even in Skagway, which is pretty wide open. But he's lucky, because what happens is just after he arrives in Skagway, very shortly afterwards, a teamster named McGrath went into a saloon, and a guy called Fay's Saloon, Ed Fay's Saloon, and Fay was the owner of the saloon, and it was common practice in Skagway. If you put a silver dollar across the bar, you got no change, but if you put a bill across the bar, you did get change. So he ordered a drink, shoved a bill across the bar with a probably a $5 or $10 bill, and the drink was probably $1.25, and waited for his change, and Fay didn't give him any change. He said, I want change. He's not getting any change. I want my change. Well, Fay just answers that. He grabs him by the scruff of the neck and fires him right out through the swinging doors. Well, McGrath doesn't like that, but he knows he's no match for Fay, so he goes down and sees a deputy marshal called Rollins. And so Rollins says, I don't like that either, and he wasn't in Smith's pay. A lot of people were, but he wasn't. So he goes back in, loaded for bear, and they break through the saloon doors. Well, Fay's ready for him. She shoots them both dead.
The policeman and McGrath, the Packard.
Yeah, and this really, the town is right on edge. Back come the vigilantes, and they had formed a committee called 101, and they're looking for Ed Fay. They're going to string him up. They're going to give him Western justice at its best. But Smith steps in and breaks it up with two 6 guns. He says the first man to put a rope around Ed Fay's neck will be answering in hell. And he meant it. So he breaks up the meeting, but he feels a little uneasy about it because people are still not very happy about it.
Fay's not a good guy.
Well, Fay's pretty rough customer, indeed. And not only that, the deputy sheriff, his young wife, just gave birth that day to a child. People were very unhappy about that. So how does Soapy Smith answer this? He answers it by becoming the benefactor. So he then starts a public subscription for the new widow and raises several $1,000s, which is a lot of money, by putting the arm on all his nefarious friends, and becomes a public benefactor. He also, some people say, well, he really did save a lynching, and so they send Fay off to Sitka, Alaska, where, by the way, he got a very, very short sentence. But it more or less establishes his rule as dictator of this particular town.
Takes the heat off him, makes him look like a good guy, allows him to continue his the growth of his empire.
Sure. And the town, by the way, is growing at this time, and here we'll see the town in its heyday. There's a packing outfit in this particular photograph. And then you look down the main street, and that's the original main street we saw before, and that's Broadway, and they're preparing for a railroad coming into town.
They're bringing the railroad right down Main Street?
Boy, are they proud of it. They're bringing it straight down Main Street. But, you know, the town itself is getting its reputation is really getting very, very rough. In fact, if you look in one of the early 1898 editions of one of the Seattle papers, 8 bodies were found on White Pass on the American side in one weekend. And almost all of these were murders. And just very shortly after that, 12 robberies on the American side and 1 murder. And the guy was murdered at such close range, the powder burns were still on his face. So that these guys were very, very tough customers. And remember, they did not, very seldom went beyond the height of land. In other words, the Northwest Mounted Police and the Canadian side were up there, and they had Maxim guns, and they were ready for it. They searched every outfit.
That map actually has a Northwest Mounted Police thing noted right on it.
That's right.
They took care of justice, and beyond this point, this kind of bad attitude didn't exist.
Well, that's right. In fact, one of the guys came in, one of the bunco artists came in and said to the mounted policeman on duty, he says, look at it, he says, what if I want to shoot my way in? And the mounted policeman opens the door, puts a 45 out, and he just starts shooting. You'll see what happens. And the guy looked at him, turned around, and walked away. So the mounted police held the law, and held it very well, beyond the summit, beyond Chilkoot, beyond White Pass. Everybody
had to come back down into this kind of a hell. They had to come back.
That's right. And another classic case, Mike, is this. When Inspector Zachary Wood, who was under Sam Steele, one of the inspectors under Sam Steele, and the other was a great uncle of mine, Strickland, which is kind of interesting, too. And anyway, Zachary Wood was supposed to take out $150,000 in gold and in bills, and they had to go out through Skagway eventually. They didn't want to go over the American side. It had such a bad reputation, even the mounted police, because they couldn't shoot a lot in the U.S. side of the line. So they decided to go over Chilkoot. Zachary Wood comes down Chilkoot, goes into Dyea, hires a boat. He gets halfway between Dyea and Skagway, and a boatload of thugs pull out toward him, trying to ram his boat. He holds them off with 2 6-shooters. He says, somebody's going to get killed. So they back away. He lands on the dock to catch a boat called the Tartar, and there on the dock waiting for him is Soapy Smith and all his heavily armed crew. But the captain of the Tartar was very sharp. He brings out about 8 or 10 sailors with loaded rifles, clears the way, and Soapy, he realizes the jig is up, that he's not going to get this money from Zachary Wood, so he says, well, would you like to stay a while? And Wood says, no, I think I'll keep on going.
I think I'll keep on going.
Yeah, whoa. And so indeed he did. And, you know, he's now at the height of his power. It's approaching the 4th of July, and he is so well known and because he built a church there, and he was the public benefactor of certain things, gave money away, of course, taking a lot more than he gave.
Yeah.
And we, you know, befriended dogs, you know, adopt a dog day and everything else. Oh, yeah, the guy was really quite original. And so bye.